Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to learn more about this, for this webinar to learn more about methane emissions from the oil and gas industry. My name is Barbara Hayes. I'm a communications manager with Environmental Defense. And we're joined today by Dale Marshall, also from Environmental Defense. He's the national program manager here, and Jamie Kirkpatrick from BlueGreen Canada, who's the program manager of BlueGreen. I'm just going to quickly walk through the agenda. We're going to start today with Dale Marshall talking about methane and its environmental impacts and what we're looking for from new regulations that are coming. Jamie Kirkpatrick will be talking about workers and opportunities. Then we'll take your questions and also give you a way that you can take action to see strong methane regulations for Canada. So we had more than 150 people sign up today for the webinar. So everyone is muted so that we can get the best connection possible. However, we do want to hear your questions. So you can ask us questions either in the question box or chat box, and I will be monitoring both throughout the webinar to pull up good questions, as many good questions as possible, and share them with Dale and Jamie at the Q&A section. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Dale now to take it away.
Great, thanks, Barbara. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the webinar. Let's see if I can get to that first slide. There we go. So I've been working on methane emissions and methane regulations federally for a while now, and there are a lot of good reasons why we need to take action on this significant source of greenhouse gas emissions. Officially, methane emissions in Canada are over 100 million tons per year. So that's about 15% of Canada's total greenhouse gas emissions. And of those 100 or so million of the federal government deciding to set a target for reducing those emissions and to put into place regulations so that the oil and gas companies were able to reduce their emissions that have both impacts on the climate but also on local health. There is increasingly scientific research that is showing that that emissions are actually higher than what we have in our greenhouse gas inventory. We produced a report last year. We published a report okay. Sorry, I've just been told that people cannot hear me. I'm not sure why that would be. Maybe I will go back and see if I'm waiting to hear from the folks. Apologies. Resolved. Barbara, can you let me know if you can hear me at this stage? Maybe in the chat box. Okay. Okay. I've been told that the audio is back on. So apologies for that. So as I was saying, I'll move a little bit back in my presentation and just talk about the fact that the research is showing that actual emissions from oil and gas facilities are being measured as higher than what is documented and what's being reported in Canada's official inventory. So every year Canada produces a report that says here are emissions from the different sectors and sends that to the United Nations. There was a symposium that happened at Carleton University in November that essentially showed that emissions from a whole bunch of different types of facilities from different regions of the country, so different parts of Alberta, British Columbia, as well as different research methodology, all seem to indicate that emissions were actually higher than what was being recorded and reported by the industry and government. So it is quite likely a much larger issue than what our inventory tells us. In terms of actually reducing those emissions, I mean, these are some of the lowest cost solutions to climate change that we have. The International Energy Agency did a report in the fall that essentially showed that globally we could reduce half of methane emissions at no net cost. And that's because methane is a really potent greenhouse gas. So if you reduce emissions by a kilogram or a ton, it's actually worth 25 times more over a 100-year span and more than 80 times more over a 20-year span. So reducing emissions has a big impact on reducing the effect on climate change and global warming. Also, solutions are technologically feasible. In some cases, it's just a monitoring program that can find leaks. Technologies are available to switch from equipment that emits a lot of methane just over the normal course of operations to ones that either emit very little or none at all, because they don't actually emit methane as part of its normal operations. And also, the reason why it can be zero cost is because in a lot of cases, this methane can be captured and used. So either used as an energy source by the industry on the facility itself, or put into a pipeline and sent to market and therefore generate an additional revenue stream. And that's what offsets any additional costs from leak detection programs or investments in equipment that would reduce emissions. So we have seen that that the methane that can actually be captured is actually quite valuable. We, all of Alberta could heat its homes by using the methane that was emitted, that is now being emitted, that could be captured. And we know that there revenue, so it's wasted gas, and there's revenue that could actually go to the governments as well in terms of royalty rates and taxes. In terms of competitiveness, we hear a lot about competitiveness these days with regards to climate solutions that are being put into place by government. So climate policies like the methane regulations. And yet in a lot of ways, we are playing catch up. There are methane regulations in place in a number of US states, Colorado, California, Wyoming, Utah, Ohio, and these are Pennsylvania. And if you look at all the facilities that are in these states, it actually is greater than the emissions, greater number of facilities in those states that are already regulated compared to all the facilities in Canada. So in a lot of ways, we are playing catch up. And methane regulations will also level the playing field across Canada. We have some provinces that are interested in actually going further British Columbia is actually considering putting a carbon price on, a carbon tax on methane emissions, which would have a bigger impact than these regulations. And there are some states like Saskatchewan that hasn't really shown interest, whereas Alberta is developing draft regulations as we speak, and we don't know for sure if they will be as strong as the federal ones. But federal regulations that have to be met or exceeded means that we're going to have a level playing field in Canada. In terms of long-term trajectory, we should be thinking about the virtual elimination of these emissions from the oil and gas sector. Again, the International Energy Agency research shows that we can go much further than the 40 to 45% reductions that we are aiming for by 2025 in the federal regulations. Again, so those emissions that go beyond that 50% that are essentially free are actually very low cost, especially compared to other sectors of the economy. One thing that needs to be taken into account as well is that Canada has committed to having zero routine flaring by 2030. So one of the solutions that has been put forward for many years to wasted methane is to capture it and flare it, so to burn it so that it produces CO2 instead of methane, which from a greenhouse gas perspective is better. But even better than that is to capture the methane and sell it into the market. And so if Canada has endorsed this and committed to going towards that, we need regulations that actually put us on the path to that. And so there's an important two-step process that we are following and in discussions with industry and with the government over ensuring that we have strong federal regulations. And the first one is that we need those regulations to be finalized very soon. And we're expecting actually for that to happen over the coming days and weeks. If those regulations are as we expect, we think that they will achieve that target and potentially allow us to go further. But the second step is that the provincial regulations that we put into place need to be equivalent. In other words, they need to reduce emissions as much as the federal rules would have. And right now, as I said before, it's an open question whether those provincial regulations will match or exceed the federal ones. And the federal government really needs to ensure that we do have provincial regulations that are equivalent, because Canada's already struggling to meet our 2030 commitment under the Paris Agreement. There's a gap that exists there between what the target is and what our policies will produce in terms of emission reductions. And so allowing provinces to get off the hook with weaker rules would open that gap even more and put us even further away from those 2030 commitments. So right now I will pass it over to Jamie to continue the webinar. Thanks a lot for your attention, and we'll have questions later.
Great. Thanks, Dale. And hopefully everyone can hear me, and I probably won't know if you can't, so let's say you can. I'm Jamie Kirkpatrick with BlueGreen Canada, and basically we know that methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, but the impacts of it have often been ignored. Dale mentioned some of those, how strong it is and how much of a destructive greenhouse gas it is. But in part, a lot of this was ignored because just wasted natural gas was part of the industrial process. It was simply a cost of doing business. Things leak, gases vent, and profits are still made, so it's never been seen as a big deal. But we're seeing that change. We're seeing, as Dale mentioned, various internet commitments that have been made, and there's a real opportunity for Canada to catch up with other jurisdictions and even lead with good regulation on this. So, and there's another reason for it, and that's what I'm here to talk about, and that is that if we continue to waste natural gas, we're missing an opportunity to create good local jobs. When oil and gas companies are regulated and are required to meet emission targets, such as investing in fixing leaks, repairing broken infrastructure, eliminating machines that vent methane and natural gas as part of how they operate. We're seeing less product wasted, and we're creating the opportunity for more work. So tackling methane emissions is really a win-win. There's really no other way to look at it. So let me just say a bit about BlueGreen before I go any further. We're an organization that's been around for about 10 years. I'm just going to try and advance the slide again. There we go. If you can see the logos of organizations that make up BlueGreen, a bit of unusual suspects. We represent some of Canada's largest industrial private sector unions, working closely with our environmental and civil society partners. We work together because we all believe that environmental issues can be addressed in ways that create positive economic and employment opportunities. Back 10 years ago, BlueGreen formed, basically trying to counter the narrative that it's jobs versus the environment. Everyone hopefully on the call recognizes that we need both of those things to succeed. So addressing methane sort of fits right within that BlueGreen wheelhouse of things that are good for the environment and good for the economy. And so everyone keeps asking why. So regulations that reduce or eliminate methane and natural gas waste create good jobs, save money for companies, and stop leaking this destructive gas into the atmosphere. And they do that through this growing industry in Canada. It's methane mitigation industry, the methane abatement industry, methane busting industry, I've heard, but it's a growth industry. There's more than 70, and let me just switch slides there. There's more than 170 companies in Canada that are involved in addressing methane emissions, helping industry plan to address emissions. Half of them provide technology, the other half provide services like leak detection and repair. And the majority of these companies are Canadian-based, small businesses with fewer than 50 employees. So it's a small business sector. It's widely acknowledged to create a bunch of jobs. And there's a lot of these companies that have started up recognizing there's an issue, but without regulation requiring industry to act and address these emissions that had traditionally just been considered the cost of doing business, they're not growing at the rate that they could. So this slide just features some information from the Methane Emissions Leadership Alliance, which is a group of those companies. You can see their website there to check out more after the webinar. They surveyed themselves and looked into, well, what will take to grow the work that we do. And if regulation comes in as has been talked about, and that is the effect of the federal regulation we've seen in previous iterations, they anticipate at least 40% of their companies would double in size. So in some cases, if that's a company of 5, they'd see the need to have 10 employees. But that does add up, and those are also very important, good, local, near the source jobs. 80% of the companies surveyed say they expect to see this growth within 12 to 18 months of the regulation coming in place. And so really the pace of which the federal government and the provincial governments roll out the requirements to reduce emissions of natural gas would play a big part in as to when these jobs would start and when people could get to work. In experience, and Dale mentioned several of the US states, an experience in US states like California and Colorado and others where oil and gas sector is required to reduce methane emissions, they've seen creation of new local jobs and economic opportunities for not only the company that's saving the gas that they're wasting, but also for some of these different companies that have started up. And the jobs are varied. There's the high level where there's engineers involved. There's also folks that just do surveying, and they go out with a infrared camera device and just scan and look. And when you see the leaks, you address them right away rather than just consider that a cost of doing business. We produced a report that was the cover image of my slide there, and it was basically just focused on the economic and job opportunities of addressing methane. And this is just apart from that, but it does basically say we could double the amount of workforce addressing methane with requirements from the federal and provincial governments that say we must actually do what we're saying we're going to do. And we did a US study on this, calculated that frequently requiring detection of leaks and repairing them and eliminating venting of gas from wells and storage tanks, and also working to replace equipment that releases methane as part of its design, would create the equivalent of 5,400 or 5,400 good-paying jobs per year in the US. And based on our calculations here, comparing the American size of the industry to the Canadian, we'd see at least 1,500 similar jobs a year in Canada, just by tackling methane leaks and emissions, and also creating the mnemonic devices that work on wells that are solar powered rather than powered by leaking gas. So over a decade, we could see this be almost 15,000 jobs in the oil and gas sector that has been seeing less and less jobs, and more as more and more automation takes over. So in speaking with folks in the industry, they see this as an issue. They see the benefit and the opportunity, but they also say that leaks are found regularly, and massive leaks are found regularly, particularly when there's a facility that hasn't been required to test their operations. And so this means that there's a high value of oil and gas companies to actually act to plug these leaks. There's a resistance to regulation in some cases, but those that I've spoken with, where they've seen this and where they've come and implemented efforts to reduce methane emissions, companies actually do so at no cost, or in some cases they even make money by capturing lost product. So there's a few reasons why regular detection is very important. First, leaks aren't predictable. They can occur anytime, anywhere. So that speaks to why there needs to be more frequent detection, which also then creates more opportunity for work for people as a side benefit. And also a very small number of leaks tend to be responsible for a huge amount of the emissions. And the only way you find those is if you actually are looking for them. So if you look once a year, you'll find a little bit. If you look 3 and 4 times a year, you'll see a greater amount of methane and natural gas no longer wasted. And this is from one study that says, if you're testing every 3 months or quarterly, roughly, you'd save 80% of the emissions, just because leaks can spring up unpredictably. So if these things are left undetected, and there's examples that were used in Environmental Defense's report and others where you just see through the infrared camera these huge plumes of odorless, colorless gas that we didn't know was there otherwise. So this also means that more frequent detections and inspections are important to the health of workers and communities near these facilities and near the oil and gas sector, because methane leaks are often accompanied by other nasty things like volatile organic compounds and other air pollutants. Benzene is affiliated with natural gas, and that is leaked in the atmosphere as a cancer-causing agent. So there's significant health benefits to acting and to address these emissions now, which also saves money in the long run, but also saves lives. So if I just do a quick recap of what I've talked about, regulating methane emissions will mean cleaner air. It'll mean fewer harmful air pollutions and greenhouse gas emissions, less industry waste of natural gas, and the sooner we act, the sooner we'll start creating good-paying jobs. So in our world, this feels like a no-brainer and something that industry would actually benefit from moving forward with. And we do hope that federal regulation will help support that and bring forward that the steps that we need to make this happen. I'm going to turn it back over to Barbara and or Dale.
Hi. Thank you both for all that stuff. So I'm going to ask everyone for questions now. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I have one here. Is the oil and gas industry doing anything on its own to reduce methane emissions from its operations?
Yeah, there are definitely some activities that are happening, some investments and reductions from the industry. Some of those they know are cost effective, so they actually get a bigger return than what it costs. However, in order to reach the target that we're looking at, we really do need those activities to be consistently undertaken across the industry, no matter what the size of the facility, no matter what the company that's involved. There are definitely companies that have taken on voluntary measures within their own operations, but overall, in order to get the consistent emission reductions across the industry, the regulations are what's needed so that all companies are obligated to undertake those activities.
Yeah, and that's borne out by experience, because those areas that weren't regulated before, maybe even resisted regulation, like in Colorado, they've surveyed those businesses that are involved, and they've actually seen the results, they've seen the benefits, they've seen the reductions, and most of them wouldn't have acted without regulation. So while there are some great sort of champions that have recognized this as valuable, we'll get even more impact with national regulation that sets the bar as to where this has to happen.
And sorry, my chat box is very small, so I'm scrolling through looking for more questions. Which states, can you guys give examples of states or countries that have really good methane regulations?
Yeah, there are a few that have far-reaching regulations. So I mentioned a few of them already. Colorado, Pennsylvania, Wyoming, Ohio are all the leading states. We've seen a lot of action from Norway on the methane issue, although the industry there is very different. It's much more of an offshore industry as opposed to a land-based one. Mexico is increasingly showing leadership on this, moving forward with its regulations, even though, as a poor developing country, you kind of expect action to happen last there, and yet we're seeing leadership happen in some cases because of the leadership that Obama showed and because of the leadership that Canada showed in moving forward on methane emissions. And in Canada, British Columbia actually has plans to have to take action on the methane emissions issue. The agreement between the Green Party and the NDP Party to form a government included a measure where methane emissions would be subject to the BC carbon tax, and that involves, at this point, a $30 a ton tax, which would mean that if that was applied, emissions would, because methane emissions are so cheap, the emission reductions would go much beyond that 40 to 45% target. We're still waiting for those to be put into place because it's relatively recent since the election, but there are a number of places that are either have taken action or are moving forward with action right now.
So we have a good question about the process for reporting in Alberta, noting that in BC, the industry self-reports. And so what does the process look like in Alberta?
So the reporting that happens, so it depends if you're looking at the greenhouse gas inventory, which has a methodology that is applied across Canada, or whether you're looking at reporting of methane emissions within each province, which is a provincial jurisdiction. And so there are differences between Alberta and BC. In Alberta, there is a methodology that's undertaken to measure those and report those emissions. And again, what we're seeing, regardless of what the province is, BC or Alberta, we are seeing that emissions, when independent research is undertaken, those emissions are actually higher than what is being reported, regardless of it being BC or Alberta, regardless of the kind of facility it is.
Right.
I don't know if Jamie wanted to add anything to that in terms of.
Well, no, just just on the higher emissions, it's, I think, just a process of not caring before about leaks and venting just being part of the process. So I think most of the measurement would happen on the output level, and in the process of producing natural gas and oil and gas products, there was always just waste, but was never accounted for. And I think this is basically just a result of people looking now and not accepting the argument that it's okay to just waste a certain percentage of gas because we know how harmful that can be. And really, I think we probably hammered this point home a bunch, but it is really the low-hanging fruit of the climate action movement. Like, we could have a huge impact by just doing this. And I think that environmental defense and other organizations have done a really good job of pointing out all of the massive benefits to doing so. So however it's reported upon, we need to just, I think, act on what we know is there, whether it's at this level or a much higher level. It's easy to address these emissions, and it should be done.
So this is a good transition. This is a good follow-up question to that. So is this an issue mostly of technology or infrastructure, or is this a question?
Sorry, you cut out.
Behavior. Oh, sorry. So is this a question about new technology or infrastructure that's needed, or is this
I still didn't quite hear that, but that's, I think what the question is whether this is technology or about behavior.
Yes.
And yeah, and basically it's going to be both, right? So the federal regulations have stipulations around monitoring. So it's called leak detection and repair. So actually getting people on site 3 times per year to use infrared cameras that Jamie was talking about to detect those leaks and to plug them. In some cases, it's using technologies that are available. So, for example, there are pneumatic devices like pumps and controllers that naturally will use methane and emit methane over the course of its normal usage. So there is equipment in some cases, though, and equipment that has been used and in place for years that do not bleed. It's called bleeding methane. They don't actually emit methane over the course of their operation. So they're either air controlled, so they're pressurized by air, or they use electricity, an electricity source. And so that technology is readily available. So for new operations, we should be putting those into place. For existing operations, we should be gradually switching those over so that we go from equipment that normally, and in the course of normal operation, will actually emit methane to equipment that doesn't at all. So it'll be a combination of different operations as well as some investment in better technology.
And I think along the way, just to speak to the economic benefit, is so many, because we have the industry here, we also have the companies that are creating those materials and those machines and those devices here. So if we have regulation that does what Dale just says and requires the phasing in of zero emission controllers or other devices, the good news is that a lot of those are built here. They're exported from Canada to jurisdictions that are already doing this. So there's a lot of companies that assemble these machines and are just waiting for them to be required. And on the behavioral side, I think it's, I guess, industry behavior we're looking at, and just the general reticence to be regulated when you can point to, everyone can point to certain reductions that have occurred and things like that, but they don't include all of these leaks that have just always been considered cost of doing business. And that's no longer going to be in a world where we're trying to meet a 1.5 degree target. These types of things can no longer be the way we do business, and they have to be addressed. So there is that behavioral acceptance and change that needs to come.
Okay. Well, with that, I think I'm going to invite people to If you haven't already, we have an easy action for you guys to sign the petition at methaneproblems.ca. You can see it on your screen. And we hope we've already had thousands of people sign this petition, and we know that it makes difference when governments hear that people care about this. So please do. Sorry, it's a letter actually, not a petition, but please do sign it. Jamie, do you have any last minute things you want to say? Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I would say just, environmental defense is going to continue following this. We will be continuously reporting on what's going to be happening federally. Like, as I said, we're expecting regulations soon. We're expecting them to be pretty good. And so, expect communications through the media and to our supporters to let people know how things are going. And then at that point, the focus switches to the provinces and whether they will want to just adopt the federal regulations, or more likely in most cases, actually have their own regulations, and to see if they're as strong or not. So there are lots of reasons to have, as have been discussed, lots of reasons to have strong regulations that will set Canada on track to significant emission reductions.
And I think just to wrap, this is a problem and an opportunity. And I think that when discussing this with folks who might want to just dismiss it, we never even mentioned our clever webinar title about cows and what they do. But I think that this is a super important issue that can be dismissed easily because it's something that is still relatively under the radar. But the benefits of acting, the benefits of trying to actually get Canada caught up with other jurisdictions are just far too great to ignore. If we are to have an oil and gas sector that is viable in the next little while, they're going to need to catch up, and people aren't going to want to buy natural gas or products that aren't addressing methane emissions. So there's an investment needed for continuing of jobs in this industry, for communities to continue to have the option. So basically, if we're going to use natural gas for the next little while, as all of the national climate plans talk about, it better be the cleanest natural gas we can produce. And the good news is doing so creates good jobs, reduces the health impacts, and we can do it relatively quickly.
Okay, awesome. And if you do want to keep in touch with both what Jamie has been saying and also with Dale, so you can hear from us as the new methane regulations come out, here's where you can find Jamie and all the awesome work he does at BlueGreen Canada. Here's how you can keep in touch with environmental defense. And thank you guys so much for joining us and for your excellent questions and your attention. We have been recording this webinar, so we will be circulating it. And if you had colleagues that missed it, or if you learned something interesting, please do share it. And we'll be sending it out in a couple of days. Thank you so much.
Thanks.